Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. My name is Nick Rafferty. I'm co-founder and COO of SureCloud. I'll try and engage with the whole of the room. It's a slightly interesting setup with a very distributed audience, so bear with me while I perhaps walk along or not and glue myself here, but we'll figure it out. Session today then is around finally delivering GRC outcomes and introducing what we're calling the age of the capability. And I think to cover what we're going to go over in this session, we'll start off by looking at, on a positive note, why things have failed in the past, or why we believe they might have struggled to deliver on the promises that GRC has always had. We'll look at why that trend continues, so even with new entrants into the product category in the market, why we still believe that potentially the fit-for-purpose product expertise offering hasn't actually been launched to the market as yet. We'll look at then embedding a measurable GRC program and some top tips on how to actually achieve that. And then we'll have a look at a case study as well with one of our customers. Customer in question actually was going to join us today, but unfortunately hasn't been able to make it. So I'll go through those case study slides, but obviously can put people in contact with David if required in the future. Okay, so in order for us to look at why we believe GRC has potentially failed to deliver over the years, it's worthwhile going through a sort of brief history lesson to look at the product category as a whole in terms of GRC from its inception, and then look at the market itself and how that's matured over the years as well. So back in 2001, Enron, 2002, and the WorldCom scandals, the US implemented or introduced the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002 into federal law. So it was effectively illegal not to be compliant with SOX. So people took it seriously, and certainly with the threat of jail, people started to take it extremely seriously. That basically was the sort of inception of GRC tooling. So the first products that came out were really sort of point solutions that were aimed around financial controls and compliance with that particular act. And they were very much rigid. There'd been nothing before. So again, if you look at the bottom of that slide there, we're looking at the maturity of the market. Back then, there wasn't really any kind of best practice around how to implement a solution that would support compliance with that particular act. So it was very much point solution, this is how you do it, and we can therefore implement in lots of large organisations and move forward with other potential opportunities. Because it was supporting organisations from a compliance perspective, lots of customers would spot an opportunity to then apply that concept to other adjacent use cases. Vendors obviously were very keen to obviously support as much expansion of offerings as they could in those accounts. But they realised that actually having a point solution just focused specifically on compliance and financial controls wouldn't meet the needs of other spreadsheet-driven processes in those adjacent use cases. So it really pushed the industry from a product offering perspective into much more of a configuration play. So that's where the larger enterprise GRC platforms, which are the sort of low-code type configuration tooling, started to really emerge, where again, looking at the maturity of the market, because there was a lack of standardization in methodologies and approaches, it meant that each organization could potentially look at addressing the same problem differently from a technology implementation perspective. So that was the sort of birth of the big sort of enterprise GRC tools. Off the back of that, the systems integrators, the big four, would obviously see a big opportunity that is effectively could be a blank canvas to then partner with these big platforms, providers, and offer big transformation projects off the back of this technology capability. So you would then see the partnerships, the go-to-market, lots of big-scale implementations in organizations where they were really major transformations being driven primarily by the systems integrator. Both end up being quite happy at that point with big projects, licensing, expanding across the organization, and everything's good. The market, though, from a maturity perspective in terms of standards, frameworks, methodologies, is still lagging behind. And again, that's why it was very much, I guess, appealing to organisations to go and be driven and led by the consulting organisations that would help them implement systems and processes. As we start to move through history, though, and there's quite a long history of it, and I think really I should start to say that the area of where we saw a lot of the kind of war stories and probably a bit of a bad reputation around GRC is around this sort of area, the 2009 to 16, where there were lots of very, very long projects. And certainly when SureCloud entered the market back in 2011, around about that sort of time, we would come across lots of anecdotes in customers and prospects around these never-ending projects. Things moved on, though. Clearly the market would start to mature. The processes, the methodologies and frameworks, many more of those that started to really materialise, and people started to look at really adopting what was much more around best practice. So rather than, in our experience as well, going into organisations where they would have risk assessment methodology, which would be a bit of a homegrown methodology mixed with a ISO 27005 type approach, it was very much actually, we've gone through the pain of trying to work with our own methodologies and homegrown approaches. We're much more open to adopting best practice. And as that best practice in the industry developed, you had the sort of inception of a lot of more point solution providers that would look at simplicity and out-of-the-box standardization. So it was very much, this is a methodology that you can pick up and run with. And it was very much focused on deep functionality in a very specific use case area. The coexistence of where that sits now really is, again, there are the enterprise GRC solutions, which again are the configurable platforms that are out there, SureCloud being one of those, alongside point solution providers that again offer that very much the more simplistic approach to supporting the process needs around GRC as a whole. And they are aiming at different types of market ultimately. So again, the applicability of which one would be right for which organisation would depend on the size and complexity ultimately. But I think the point really here is that the product category was created where the market was extremely immature in terms of frameworks and support and standardised approaches to actually guide organisations in what best practice was. And I think a lot of people got into a lot of trouble through driving the design and configuration for what they were currently doing in spreadsheet-based systems. So office productivity tools like spreadsheets, which are always going to be infinitely more flexible than any kind of system, and trying to get those sort of supported in high-grade enterprise solutions. So focusing on that specifically, again, the sort of 2009 to 16 area that we were looking at, it's all around the sort of enterprise organisations. So a lot of the issues were really born out of the complexity of the organisations. So these were tended to be, certainly from the SOX perspective, large public companies in the US. They, by their very nature, had a lot of complexity associated with them. They were focused, again, much more on supporting areas of the organisation where they had actually addressed the process needs through, again, a spreadsheet that might be supported by an email, that might be supported by another spreadsheet that's tracking things, and making sure that we can implement that and support it, because the last thing that we really need to do is impact our users, ultimately. They need familiarity, they've built these systems themselves or processes themselves, and they need to be supported through the technology that we implement. At the same time, with the limitless boundaries of the technology, so the platforms that have been driven by that lack of standardization to support any kind of configuration requirement, that was then facilitated to go further into scope creep, ultimately, where, again, we've been in situations where you would be talking about one specific use case, and then somebody else would be introduced to the conversation who would say, well, actually, that looks a bit like an area that I'm also supporting. Could we integrate that into this kind of process? And the answer is yes, 100%. The technology will support it. Is it the right thing to do? Probably not, because that wasn't the initial outcome in mind. But it happens. And again, anything that I'm talking about today, we've experienced pain of this ourselves as a company. What you ended up with, though, is extremely complex solutions, ultimately, that almost match the complexity of the size of organisations that they've been implemented in the first instance. And that led to customer dissatisfaction, vendor frustration, because the relationship starts to really get tense. You then have the end of the contract terms where the vendor would be asked to leave, part ways. The vendor selection process would commence again, and the merry-go-round would be spinning. And we've seen this so many times. There was a kind of, again, I guess, semi-joke in the industry from a vendor perspective, which there were a number of very big organisations delivering solutions, and it was kind of which one are you using this year? Which is not a great position to be in from a, we really believe there's a lot of value to deliver from a GRC perspective. What are the attempts to solve this problem, though? So, again, the one that I've just really talked about is the relationship between enterprise GRC providers and systems integrators. So, in principle, that sounds like the perfect solution. You have a enterprise-grade software proposition. You have world-class consulting and systems integration expertise, and you would think that the two together would obviously then deliver a fantastic solution, but ultimately they are slightly misaligned in what they're looking to achieve. Clearly the appeal, as I've said, for the SIs is this is a blank page ultimately. Yes, you might have bought some catalogue SKUs or products, but actually we can configure these however you want them, and let's throw them away. We'll start again because your organisation is very, very special and specific. And this is a big project for you specifically that you should feel really good about, and we'll go down that route. There's a definite misalignment there in how that's actually taken to market. The point solution providers, and I wouldn't say that I would call these as being any kind of failure in that sense. They are very good point solution providers, but they are what they say they are point solution providers. And again, if you're looking at large organisations, the real benefit and value of GRC, in my mind, is the sharing of information that's relevant across use cases. And looking at a siloed area, even if it's deep, simple, can be adopted, without then the bigger picture and being able to share that information across those use cases, I think you're missing a real trick and an opportunity. I've added in tech-enabled service providers in there as well as part of an attempt to solve this issue. I know that they're much more on the sort of consulting expertise led side of things. So this is really, again, from an SI, the expertise piece is firmly there. They're looking to really then operationalise what they're delivering from a service perspective to make sure that real value is driven into the organisation. So no longer just having the individual project engagements. We're going to implement some automation into your organisation that is going to help you then really drive some improvements that is off the back of anything that we've delivered from a consulting perspective. The issue with those in terms of solving this issue is that they are very, very narrow and specific to the services that are being delivered. And because they are consulting companies, first and foremost, the enterprise functionality that is required of large organisations, things like integrations through APIs and things like that, tend to be very immature. So I would argue that all of the three different types of approaches there really kind of missed the point. One is an independent software vendor working with an independent consulting expertise. The second is a software organisation without necessarily having the expertise to drive the adoption and embedding of the solution. And the third is a consulting organisation that has a degree of automation that probably isn't fit for purpose for an enterprise organisation. So what does this really mean in reality? So if you have a misalignment between the software and the expertise, and you can apply this thinking to any product category or any real job to be done, as I'll come on to, you end up with potential risk of poorly adopted software, isolated consulting engagements where the consulting provision is not then linked in or tightly integrated with the software, in which case then the process side of things is quite painful to actually then facilitate any real driving of value through the domain expertise that you've engaged with. That can lead to suboptimal processes, no single point of accountability, and I go back to the kind of SI enterprise vendor perspective there, where again you're dealing with different organisations, that there is a potential for them to be pointing at each other. And then the risk of project failure. And then you look back, did we really achieve the outcome that we thought about in the first place? Well, possibly not. So what do we think the answer is? So we think it's in something we call capabilities. And capabilities, for me, directly underpin outcomes. And it's the right mix of software and tightly integrated expertise. And it's that tightly integrated piece that is really the key thing here. So we're looking at really making sure that anything that's delivered through, and this isn't implementation services where we're configuring, this is domain expertise that can help organisations understand how the technology works, for sure. So they're the conduit between the technology provider, the domain, and the customer ultimately. And that expertise is something that we really believe is something that is needed, certainly in the initial design of any kind of solution, but more importantly, it's needed in the longer term for adoption and embedding of any kind of GRC solution. And that's really guiding through risk assessment processes, control checks, those sorts of things. How do we do it? How do we go about it? We've clearly had a lot of experience of implementing these solutions in many, many organisations of all different sizes. So there's lots of knowledge there that we can help organisations get the best out of this type of solution. Capabilities have to be delivered in a very flexible manner though. So we're not saying that every organisation has to have expertise because it's the way that we would do things. It's what's right for each type of organisation. So it may be that you want to deliver the capability to your organisation yourselves, perfectly fine. The software that will allow you to do that, you have the expertise, you're good to go, so long as we keep reminding you about the longer term adoption and embedding, which again we think is really missed in the industry. It could be a hybrid solution where we share the expertise. So you could have a vendor program that you want to outsource 100 of the vendors that are lower risk and concentrate on the top 10 in-house. Or it could be a capability that is delivered fully for you on your behalf through effectively like a managed service. It's a bit of a different way of thinking actually, and this is something that we've done a lot of research on and market testing. And it's interesting going through it. By the way, you can see where my graphic design has come into this rather than the actual agencies that we use. We've market tested this. It's really interesting when you kind of go through the thought pattern here. If you think about a desired outcome, and I'll give an example. So if I wanted to ensure my organisation's exposure to vendor risk was reduced, that's my outcome that I want to achieve, I would immediately think, okay, in order to do that, I probably need to identify my vendors. I need to catalogue and assess them in some way. And I need to make sure that there's a remediation management program that makes sure that they've fixed the things that I'm interested in them fixing. So those three things I've just talked about are jobs to be done. There's nothing to do with software or services. It's immediately you think, well, what do I need to do to get this done? And those are capabilities, ultimately. But in the current world, we're forced to be either a software company or a consulting company. And that forces any kind of buyer to immediately skip over that job to be done stage to go into a software evaluation or a consulting practice. It could be, I look internally, have I got the current software that will support this need? Yes, no. No, go external, software evaluation. Have I got the people to support this? Yes, no. No, go external to find a consulting partner to help me with. Immediately you've gone off track at that point. So the job to be done has been split into two. And it's worse than that because it's one step removed from the outcome in the first instance that you're looking to achieve. So do you ever get back there? So we started thinking about this sort of concept, thinking, well, it's really interesting to look at the desired outcome again. If I could buy the job to be done without having to think about software or services split, and I just concentrated on the capabilities needed to get that outcome achieved, it'd be a great thing. And you'd have know-how, expertise, and more importantly, metrics that will allow you then to measure. So again, the integration of expertise and services is really important to be able to measure on a common playing field, common metric ultimately. So again, if you're dealing with independent, you have one way of measuring the success of a program within software, another way that might be success of a consulting engagement through project delivery. It is a different way of thinking, and if you're still with me on this, then it enables you to kind of go from a product-centric view and that product software evaluation into an outcome-centric view. So you are still directly related to the outcomes around the jobs to be done. You go from a project-based thinking in terms of consulting engagements into much more of a longer-term relationship. So this isn't just dipping in and out of consulting engagements. I know that these things independently are provided. The other one that's really interesting for us is around the shared risk model. So by that I mean there are a lot of implementations of GRC solutions that require huge upfront investment from an implementation services perspective. And really that risk is all yours at that point because you've paid for it. And if it doesn't work out, then you might need to ask for more money. The vendor doesn't really suffer at that point. Yes, you might not be happy with them, but you're kind of in it, you're committed. And we're really thinking actually that model needs to change, where it's a shared risk model, where we help with that initial project, where it's not putting a lot of pressure on an organisation to throw everything into that initial engagement, that initial implementation, and allow it to mature over time. You go from having siloed providers to unified through technology. Again, a common way of actually measuring the success. And then at the end there, the unquantifiable, or difficult to quantify, to actually measurable. Paul Proctor has actually done some great research over the years, and he launched outcome-driven metrics in Washington this year. So I'd encourage you to read all about that. It's really interesting, and that's certainly where we believe outcomes are definitely where organisations need to focus on, and that's where the board is really interested ultimately. It's not around the sort of technical side of things, as we all know. Capabilities are everywhere though. We're starting to see the market change. So certainly in the GRC market, there are providers out there that are traditional software providers that are definitely starting to look at expertise in-house, not just through partnerships, through SIs. They are starting to think actually there is a need here that we're missing, and it's about that longer term adoption, engagement, and longer term relationship, and really driving the value. We're just implementing an objectives and key results system in the business, and that is delivered through a capability. It's not about the software, it's not about customer success, support, how do you do this, how do you do that in the software. It's about how do you go about creating a good objective with some key results that will measure it, and people, industry experts with deep domain expertise that are guiding us through that process. So this is something that we're seeing definite movement in this direction, where software vendors are definitely seeing the value in having domain expertise, not just success and support people within the organisation. So just, I guess, some top tips on embedding a GRC program that's measurable. So if you that might be a leap of faith. I think all I'm trying to really do is challenge a way of thinking that is the jobs to be done directly related to outcomes, rather than just be in the software or consulting evaluation process and trying to pin them together to get the job done. But ultimately, I think from embedding a program in an organisation, you have to really work with providers that are willing to challenge. And it's always, again, with the industry as where it's got to from a platform perspective and the ability to configure. If a customer will say to you, can you do it like this? The answer generally is yes. And again, we've suffered from this. The answer is generally yes, we will do it and we will get on with it, because that's what you need to do. You need to deliver on what your customers need. But ultimately, we need people and providers in there that are questioning those sorts of things. And that's where the expertise does come in. It's that conduit between the software and understanding the technology capabilities, the domain, and what the organisation is attempting to achieve through outcomes, ultimately. So you have to have a provider that is willing to challenge. Equally, you have to be open to understanding and listening to those challenges. that's important. We, as a company, would say that we have standard products and we understand that there is a need to configure. There's definitely complexity in organisations. There are non-negotiable processes. But if we start to configure more than 20% away from our core offering, it's alarm bells. There's something not quite right with this particular engagement. And we try and get it back on track as quick as we can and say, well, actually, let's have a look at this again. So the need may have changed. You could have different stakeholders coming into the design processes that have different opinions. You might be engaging different users at different levels of the organisation that definitely will have different views of what good looks like from the infrequent nature of their interaction. So it's making sure that you get all of those up front, established and participating in the design process. Focusing on the outputs, so again, reporting perspective, making sure that you've got the output in mind. Reporting is critical. There tends to be, and this is again down for us to guide organisations, but there tends to be a focus on getting the processes right, the user experience right, which are absolutely critical. But if we can't deliver the output that's required from a design perspective, and ultimately these are underlying technical designs that we're creating, ultimately, then it's kind of pointless if we can't deliver the value in terms of reporting and insight that you're looking to achieve. And then I've said budget for additional consulting. So if you don't buy into capabilities as a concept, I think that the bit that is really missing is that focus on post-implementation, and that is about the longer term. Start simple and mature over time. Don't go for the big bang implementation and kitchen sink it with everything you think you might need one day, because you probably don't in reality. You probably don't. Case study. So I've got about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to whiz through this case study. As I said, David Atkinson was going to be here today to kind of chat to people around the experience. So Griffiths and Armour is an insurance broker that we've worked with, and this is really one of our first capability type engagements. SureCloud had two kind of separate offerings. We were a GRC company and we had consulting expertise, and we kept them separate until we kind of realised and were asked by our customers why we were doing that, because clearly they're tightly integrated and delivered through the same technology platform and can help ensure the success of these programs in the longer term. So G&A wanted to look at ISO 27001. It's a good thing to do. It's around protecting customer data, proving that they take security, information security extremely seriously. They engaged with us in terms of helping them establish the ISMS within the organisation, so expertise to help establish that, software to underpin the processes and the applications that would form a good ISMS. But they ultimately recognised that they had a lack of resource in-house, and actually to do it all themselves, they'd have probably had to recruit 3 people full-time. But they probably wouldn't have been doing a full-time job. They'd have been doing it part-time, but they had different specialisms. It was actually in this type of capability model, it allows organisations the flexibility to dip into expertise that is very specific to that need for only the amount of time that it's required. So that's something that was definitely seen as a real benefit from a capability type approach to implementing this type of program. So that was a challenge. The solution, as I mentioned, we worked with G&A very closely, we still do in the longer term, to establish that ISMS. And the outcome was that they achieved ISO 27001 certification. Now clearly I'm not saying that we were entirely responsible for that, but what has happened is this really in-depth working relationship between the two organisations where we understand exactly what's needed. They can use us and leverage our skill set as they require, to the depth that they require, within a subscription type offering that gives them certainty over time, cost, all of those sorts of things. There's lots of benefits around it. And I think the automation element and longer term relationship is the really key here. So if you're just implementing GRC as a product, then eye on adoption, longer term and embedding. That's something that is absolutely missed in the market. And again, with these types of programs where an ISMS and a certification is not just for Christmas, it's for life, obviously. So that kind of ongoing program and assistance with the program is really needed. I'm kind of over time now, so I'll wrap up quickly. But if anyone would like a conversation around this, then thank you very much for listening and spending your morning with me. Really appreciate it. So thanks a lot.